This is the key to solving quadratic equations, and this is factoring number 8. And so number 1, we have 7x times 2x plus 7 times 5x minus 2 equal 0. And so I want you to notice that in these problems, now some of these are not quadratic. You'll notice that's not quadratic. This is not quadratic, and so on. So these are polynomial equations, but you want to solve these by factoring. And so in number 1, and in fact all of these, since we're solving by factoring, remember you're going to use a zero factor property. And so the zero factor property says if you have 2 or more factors whose product is 0, then one of those factors has to be 0. I want you to notice, though, in number 1, it's already factored for you. You have, now 7 is a factor and x is a factor, but we're going to put those together since they're monomials. So we have 7x, we have 2x plus 7, and we have 5x minus 2 that are being multiplied together, and that product is 0. So according to zero factor property, one of these must be 0. Each of those contains variable expressions, so one of those must be 0. So I get 7x equals 0. I say each one equal to 0. 2x plus 7 equals 0. 5x minus 2 equals 0. And it's just a matter of you solving each of those linear equations. And so when I do that, I'm going to get divide both sides by 7. I get x to be 0. You have to remember that 0 divided by 7 is 0. Over here, subtract 7 from both sides. I get 2x equal negative 7. Divide both sides by 2. My second solution is negative 7 halves. Over here, adding 2 to both sides, I get 5x equal 2. Divide both sides by 5. I get x to be 2 fifths. So those are your 3 solutions. Number 2. Number 2, we have x cubed minus 64x equals 0. Okay, so this is not factored, but you have to remember to factor a polynomial, you got to look for the GCF first. So the GCF here is x. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out an x. When I factor out an x, I get x times x squared minus, and then x times 64 is negative 64x, and that's equals 0. So again, make sure you say 0 here, equals 0. What I want you to notice, though, is that I can factor this further because that's the difference of 2 squares. So you must do that. You must factor further. So I get x times x minus 8 times x plus 8 equals 0. Because remember, the direction said solve by factoring, so you need to factor further. So factor completely. So now notice I have 3 factors, and those 3 factors contain variable expressions. So one of those has to be 0. So you're going to use the zero factor property, and you're going to set each of those equal to 0. So I get x equals 0, x minus 8 equals 0, x plus 8 equals 0. And then it's just a matter of you solving for each of those variables, solving each of those equations. So here, x is already by itself, so I already have one of my solutions at 0. Here, adding 8 to both sides, I have the other solution, positive 8. Here, subtracting 8 from both sides, I have the other solution, negative 8. So those are your 3 solutions. All right, number 3. In number 3, we have this equation. You have 2y cubed minus 10y squared minus 100y equals 0. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is to look for a GCF, and the GCF here is 2y. So factor it out. It helps if you do the correct GCF, 2y. So get 2y times y squared is 2y cubed. 2y times a negative 5y is a negative 10y squared. And then 2y times a negative 50 is a negative 100y equals 0. Now, just like we did with number 2, you must factor completely. So if you look at this trinomial right here, it can be factored. So you must go off to the side and figure out how to factor that. So when you factor this, it looks like the factors that's going to work will be 10 and 5. So I need 10 here, 5 here, and it turns out that the 10 will be negative and the 5 will be positive. So to always check, y times y is y squared. A negative 10 times a positive 5 is a negative 50. The outer is 5y, the inner is negative 10y, and when I add them up, I get negative 5y. So that's going to go here now. So I get 2y times y minus 10 times y plus 5 equal 0. So now you're going to use a zero factor property. So put the monomial factors together. So 2y minus 10, I'm sorry, y minus 10, and then y plus 5. So, so those three products multiplied together will give you 0. So one of those has to be 0. So you set each one equal to 0, just like we did previously. And you solve for y now. So you have these linear equations. So you went from this cubic equation, this polynomial equation, to 3 linear. So to solve for y, I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and then I get y to be 0 divided by 2 is 0. So there's one of your solutions. Over here, add 10 to both sides, so I get y equal 10. So there's your other solution. Subtract 5 here, you get your other solution. So those are your 3 solutions. Number 4, we have n cubed minus 8n squared minus n plus 8 equals 0. Okay, so again, look for a GCF. So the GCF here is 1, but I have 4 terms. So remember to factor polynomial 4 terms, we're going to try grouping. So let's group the first 2, the last 2. So in the first group, I can factor out an n squared. N squared. And I'm left with n squared times n is n cubed. N squared times a negative 8 is a negative 8n squared. From the second group, remember, always factor out that negative symbol right here, that sign. So I'm going to factor out a negative, and the GCF here is 1. So when I do that, negative 1 times n is a negative n. Negative 1 times a negative 8 is a positive 8. You must say equals 0. Always check that this 2 should be the same now. So now I can factor out an n minus 8. And when I factor out an n minus 8, I'm left with n squared minus 1 equals 0. Now, just like the others, just like we did here, you need to make sure you can factor further. I can factor this further because that's the difference of 2 squares. So I get n minus 8 times n plus 1 times n minus 1 equals 0. And so now I have 3 factors whose product is 0, so one of those has to be 0. So you said each one of those equal to 0. And so you get n to be 8, n to be negative 1, and over here, when you add 1 to both sides, you get n to be positive 1. Okay? Number 5. Number 5, we have x times 3x minus 5 equal 8. All right, now that's going to be a little bit challenging for some people. Because what they want to do is they're so used to doing this. Watch. So if we go back to number 1, they're so used to taking these three factors and setting it equal to 0. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, I'm going to set each of those equal to 8. That's not true. You don't do that. The only time you set factors equal to a number is if that number is 0. Okay? That number you just set equal to must be 0. So what you got to do first is you have to distribute first. And so we get x times 3x is 3x squared. X times a negative 5 is a negative 5x equal 8. And now that looks more like some of the problems we had earlier where you had to put this in standard form. So now we're going to bring the 8 over. So we get 3x squared minus 5x minus 8 equals 0. So now I'm going to, since it's a 0, I'm going to use factoring now because I can use a 0 factor property. So we're going to factor this quadratic. Now this is quadratic now. So I'm going to factor this quadratic equation. It's still a polynomial equation, but it's quadratic. And let's see what works. So I need negative 5 from the middle term. I need these two to multiply and give me negative 8. So let's see. Let's try 4 and 2. And it looks like the 4, I'm trying to see which one. So that one works. Let's put, it would be 8 and 1 then. Let's put the 8 here, the 1 there. So 4 and 2 is not going to work. We have to try 8 and 1. Because look, the outer is 3x, the inner is 8x. Since that's signed negative, these have to be different. So the outer is 3x, the inner is 8x. When I subtract 3 from 8, I get 5. but I need this to be negative, the middle term to be negative, so that's going to have to make this 8 negative and this 1 positive. All right, now always check. 3x times x is 3x squared. A negative 8 times a positive 1 is a negative 8. The outer is 3x. The inner is negative 8x. When I add them up, I get negative 5x. Now I'm going to set each of these equal to 0. So I get 3x minus 8 equals 0. X plus 1 equals 0. Adding 8 to both sides, I get 3x equal 8. Divide both sides by 3. I get one of my solutions is 8/3. Over here, subtracting 1 from both sides, I get x to be negative 1. So those are your two solutions. Okay, number 6, we have this. We have x plus 3 times x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. All right, so it goes back to number 1. It looks like it's already factored, but the problem is that this part is not factored completely. So you got to factor this completely. So we have x plus 3 times x plus 3 times x plus 2. So that's how you factor this trinomial. That's this right here. And always check. X times x is x squared. 3 times 2 is 6. The outer is 2x. The inner is 3x. I get 5x equals 0. So now you have 3 factors whose product is 0. So according to the 0 factor property, one of those has to be 0. So all you do is just set each one equal to 0, just like this. Okay. Now I want you to note, see how these two are the same? Just do one of them. Just do one of them. Don't list your solutions twice. So see how here x to be negative 3, x to be negative 3, x to be negative 2 when you solve for x? So when you say your solution, though, this is what I need for you to do. Don't put this twice. It's just list it once. So you're going to say solutions are negative 3, comma, and then negative 2. That's all you do. Okay? All right, so that is the key to the factoring worksheet number 8.